There is a question almost everyone answers the same way. If a stranger in a lab coat handed you a switch and told you that pressing it would hurt an innocent person, really hurt them, more with every press, you would refuse. You would stand up. You would walk out of the room. 95% of people, asked in advance, are certain that is exactly what they would do. And 95% of them are wrong about who they would become the moment the room was real, the coat was real, and a calm voice said quietly, "Please continue." Because the thing that makes a normal person keep pressing that switch is not cruelty. It is something far more ordinary. Something that is almost certainly working on you, and you cannot feel it yet. In the summer of 1961, a 27-year-old psychologist at Yale University built a machine. His name was Stanley Milgram. The machine was a long gray box with 30 switches in a row, each one labeled with a voltage, 15 at one end, 450 at the other. Under the numbers were words: slight shock, moderate, strong, intense, and at the far end, past a red band, two more: danger, severe shock, and simply XXX. The machine did nothing. It generated no current at all. It was a prop, a very convincing prop, built to answer one question that had haunted Milgram since the trial of a Nazi bureaucrat named Adolf Eichmann had opened in Jerusalem that same spring. Eichmann had helped organize the transport of millions of people to their deaths, and his defense, repeated calmly from inside a glass booth, was that he had simply followed orders, that he was a small man in a large machine, that the responsibility was not his. The world called that a monster's excuse. Milgram wondered if it was something worse. He wondered if it was the truth. So he placed an ordinary person in front of his machine. A teacher, a salesman, an engineer, a postal clerk, recruited from the towns around New Haven for $4.50. He told them they were helping science study memory and learning. He told them that the man in the next room, strapped to an electrode, would try to memorize pairs of words. And every time that man made a mistake, the person at the machine was to deliver a shock. One switch higher each time. 15 more volts every time. The man in the next room was an actor. He never received a single shock. But the person at the machine did not know that. They heard him. They heard him grunt, then protest, then scream, then beg to be let out. Then, at a certain voltage, go silent. And here is what the world has spent 60 years trying to accept. When a calm man in a gray coat, standing just behind them, said the words, "The experiment requires that you continue," most of them continued. Not a pathological few, most. The question this raises is not, who were these terrible people? That question is a trap, and avoiding it is the whole point. The real question is the one Milgram spent his life inside. What exactly happens in the mind of a normal person, step by step, that lets them do something they would swear, that they did swear minutes earlier, they could never do? Over the next 50 minutes, we are going to take that apart. Not the horror of it, the way it is built. 5 psychological mechanisms, each with a name, each documented, each of which was working in that room at Yale. And each of which is working right now, in offices and institutions and chains of command that look nothing like a laboratory and function exactly like one. The first mechanism is the one that gets a person to sit down at the machine in the first place, and it has almost nothing to do with fear. To understand what happened at that machine, you have to understand the state a person was in before they ever touched it. They had volunteered. That matters more than it seems. They answered a newspaper ad. Yale University, a study of memory, 1 hour of your time, payment on arrival. They drove to a laboratory on a famous campus. They were greeted by a man in a technician's coat with a clipboard. Everything about the room told them the same thing. This is legitimate. This is science. This is being run by people who know what they are doing, in a place built for exactly this. And they were paid at the door. Before anything began, Milgram handed them the 450, and told them the money was theirs to keep no matter what happened. He was removing, on purpose, the one excuse a person might later reach for. I only did it because I needed the money. He wanted no financial lever. He wanted to see the thing underneath. And before any switch was ever pressed, there was a ritual, staged carefully to build the authority up piece by piece until it felt like a fact of the room. The subject and the actor drew slips of paper to see who would be the teacher and who the learner. The draw was rigged. The real subject always became the teacher. Then they watched the learner led into the next room, seated and strapped down. Arms fixed, an electrode taped to the wrist, paste applied, the experimenter explaining that the paste was to avoid blisters and burns. In the standard version, the learner mentioned, mildly, that he had a slight heart condition and asked whether the shocks were dangerous. The experimenter answered that the shocks could be painful but would cause no permanent tissue damage. That sentence was doing enormous work. It acknowledged the pain and then quietly certified that a legitimate expert had judged it safe. It handed the subject a reason, pre-approved from above, to keep going. And then the most important detail of the whole setup. Before the teaching began, the experimenter gave the teacher a real shock. 45 volts from the third switch, so they would know the machine was genuine. It was the only real shock in the entire experiment, and it was delivered to the person who would never feel another one. From that moment, the teacher had felt the current in their own body. They had no reason to doubt that every switch they pressed was doing exactly what the machine said it did. The prop had been made real in the one place it needed to be real, inside the mind of the person about to use it. That thing at the center of it all has a name, our first mechanism. Mechanism 1. Legitimate authority. Here is the definition. Human beings do not evaluate every instruction on its own merits. We evaluate the source. When a command comes from someone we have accepted as a legitimate authority, someone whose right to give instructions in this particular setting feels established, we shift a large part of our judgment onto them. We stop asking, "Is this correct?" and start asking, "Am I doing what I was told?" Those are completely different questions. And most of the time, in ordinary life, letting the second one replace the first is not madness. It is how a society functions. You take the medication the doctor prescribes without rederiving pharmacology. You follow the flight attendant toward the exit without auditing their reasoning. Legitimate authority is a mental shortcut that usually saves your life. The mechanism is not a defect, it is a feature, and a feature can be aimed. Now the case. Milgram understood that the authority in the room had to feel real, so he engineered it with great care. The experimenter wore a gray lab coat, not white, which reads as medical, but gray, which reads as technical, official, neutral. He carried himself with quiet, unhurried confidence. He never raised his voice. He never threatened. He had, in his possession, exactly 4 sentences, and he was instructed to deliver them in order, calmly, whenever the subject hesitated. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. That is all. 4 prods. No shouting, no coercion in any physical sense. If the subject still refused after the 4th, the session ended. The entire weight pressing on that person was the calm authority of a man who represented science, in a building that represented Yale. And the finding underneath it is worth stating plainly, because it is the part people resist. Before Milgram ran a single subject, he described the setup to groups of Yale seniors and to a panel of psychiatrists and asked them to predict the results. How many people, out of 100, would go all the way to 450 volts? The psychiatrists estimated that about 1 person in 1,000 would go to the end, and that this person would be a disturbed outlier, a sadist. The students guessed much the same. Everyone assumed that going to the maximum was a sign of something broken in the individual. In the baseline experiment, 65% of subjects went to the maximum. Not 1 in 1,000. Roughly 2 in 3. Ordinary people, from ordinary jobs, with no measurable difference in cruelty from you, obeying a calm man in a gray coat to the last switch on the machine. The gap between what the experts predicted and what actually happened is a factor of about 600, and that gap is itself the finding. It tells you that we badly overestimate our own independence. We look for the cause of obedience in the character of the person when it lives in the structure of the situation. Milgram had a phrase for the mistake. We look for the answer in the man when it is in the room. Stop for a moment and notice something about yourself. As you have been listening, part of you has been quietly filing this away. Those people, that era, that experiment, a safe distance. You would have been the 35%. Hold on to that certainty. We are going to come back for it. Knowing that authority moves people explains why they sat down at the machine. It does not explain the harder thing, why they did not get up. The first shock was 15 volts. Nothing. A tickle. Getting a person to press 15 volts requires no explanation at all. The question is how you get from 15 to 450. And the answer is not one big decision, it is the absence of one. Mechanism 2. Incremental Commitment. The definition first. People will refuse a large request that they would have accepted if it had been broken into a sequence of small ones, each one only slightly larger than the last. There is never a moment that feels like the moment. Every step is trivially close to the step before it, and so the person never meets a clean line to refuse at, because the line has been dissolved into a slope. Look again at the machine. This is the detail people miss, and it is the most important piece of physical design in the whole study. The switches did not jump. They rose in increments of 15 volts. 15, 30, 45, 60. Each switch was only 15 volts more than the one your finger had just left. Now put yourself in the chair. You have pressed the switch marked 150. The man in the next room has, for the first time, shouted to be let out. You feel it, the pull to stop. But look at what the machine is actually asking of you next. Not, will you torture this man? Just one more switch, 165. You have already done 150. What is 15 more volts on top of what you have already done? That is the trap in its purest form. At every single step, the next step is almost identical to the place you are already standing. To refuse at 165, you would have to explain why 165 is monstrous, but 150, which you just did, was acceptable. And you cannot. There is no clean answer. So you press again. And now you are at 165, looking at 180, having the same thought. The case for how powerful this is comes from outside the laboratory, from two psychologists named Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser, working in California in the mid-1960s. They went door to door and asked homeowners to allow a large, ugly billboard reading, "Drive carefully," to be installed on their front lawn. Almost everyone refused, of course they did. It was an absurd request. But for a second group, they did something first. 2 weeks earlier, a different person had come to the same doors and made a tiny request. Would you display this 3-inch sticker in your window, supporting safe driving? Nearly everyone said yes. It cost nothing. It was almost meaningless. Then the big request came, and among the people who had said yes to the tiny sticker, more than 76% now agreed to the enormous billboard, a request they would have laughed at 2 weeks before. The researchers called it the foot-in-the-door technique. Here is the mechanism underneath it. Once you have taken a small action, a quiet thing happens inside you. You revise your image of yourself to match what you just did. I am the kind of person who supports this, and having become that person, the next request is not a new decision. It is just staying consistent with who you have already decided you are. The psychologist Daryl Bem gave this its formal name a few years later, self-perception theory. We tend to assume the order runs one way, that our beliefs cause our actions. Bem showed that it runs the other way too, and more often than we would like. We look at what we have already done, and reason backward to the kind of person who must have done it. Action first, identity second. This is why the smallest commitment is never small. It is not the sticker on the window that matters. It is that the sticker quietly edits your answer to the question, "Who am I?" And every future request is now measured against that new, slightly moved answer. The pull to stay consistent with our own past behavior is one of the most reliable levers in all of social psychology, precisely because it feels like integrity from the inside. Refusing the next step does not feel like wisdom, it feels like hypocrisy. And most people would rather cause harm than feel like a hypocrite. Milgram's machine is the foot-in-the-door technique built into hardware. Every 15-volt switch is a 3-inch sticker. By the time a subject reached the danger zone, they had already pressed 20 switches. 20 small yeses. To stop now was not to refuse one shock. It was to declare that the last 20 had been wrong. And the mind protects itself from that conclusion, fiercely, because that conclusion is unbearable. It is genuinely, mechanically easier to press one more. The modern version is not a laboratory and does not involve electricity. It is any system that advances in increments small enough that no single step feels like a decision. Think about how a person is drawn, over months, into financial misconduct inside an organization. Never a moment where someone says, "Commit fraud." Instead, a sequence of adjustments, each one only slightly past the last, each one defended as basically the same as what we did last quarter. Think about how ordinary people are radicalized, or how a relationship becomes controlling, or how a professional crosses an ethical line they would have defended fiercely if you had named it on day one. None of these are single choices. All of them are slopes. The absence of a clean line to refuse at is not an accident of these systems. In the ones that work, it is the design, which leaves a problem the small step does not fully solve. A slope explains why there is no obvious place to stop. It does not explain the strangest thing the subjects reported afterward, that while they were pressing those switches, many of them did not feel like the author of what they were doing at all. They felt like an instrument, a hand on a lever moved by someone else. That feeling has a name too, and it is the center of the whole machine. Mechanism 3, the Agentic State. This was Milgram's own theory, the idea he built specifically to explain what he had watched happen in that room, because nothing already in psychology quite fit. The definition. A person can operate in one of two modes. In the first, which Milgram called the autonomous state, you experience yourself as the origin of your actions. You did it, therefore you answer for it. In the second, the agentic state, you experience yourself as an agent carrying out another person's wishes. The action still flows through your hands, but you no longer feel that it starts with you. You are, in your own perception, an instrument, and instruments do not carry guilt. A hammer is not responsible for the wall. The shift between these two states is not gradual, and it is not something you decide. It is a switch that flips when you accept someone else as the rightful author of the situation. And once it flips, the whole moral weight of the act relocates. You are no longer asking, "Should I be doing this?" You are asking, "Am I performing well for the person who is doing this through me?" Milgram noticed that subjects in the grip of the agentic state often became anxious, not about the victim, but about whether they were being a good subject, whether they were following the procedure correctly. The conscience does not switch off, it just changes what it is watching. It stops watching the harm and starts watching the performance. The case is in the transcripts, and it is chilling in how ordinary it is. Again and again, subjects who were sweating, trembling, laughing in distress, begging the experimenter to go check on the man next door, kept pressing the switches. And when they turned to the experimenter and asked the question that mattered, "Who is responsible if something happens to him?" the experimenter answered, calmly, "I am responsible." And that was often enough. Not always, but often, the tension visibly drained out of the subject the moment responsibility was transferred in words. Nothing about the situation had changed. The man next door was in exactly the same danger 1 second after that sentence as 1 second before it. The only thing that changed was a single word about ownership, and it was enough to let a trembling person keep going, because what they needed was not permission to stop, it was permission to continue without it being theirs. The science here connects straight back to Eichmann and to the philosopher who watched his trial. Hannah Arendt, reporting from Jerusalem in 1963, coined a phrase that has been misunderstood ever since: the banality of evil. People took it to mean that evil is boring, or that Eichmann was secretly ordinary and therefore innocent. That is not what she meant. She meant something far more unsettling: that the machinery of atrocity does not require monsters, it requires clerks. It requires men who have entered the agentic state so completely that they experience mass murder as paperwork, as logistics, as a job to be done competently for a superior. The horror is not that they were sadists. The horror is that they were not. Milgram's laboratory produced in 1 hour on a Yale campus, in miniature, the exact psychological state Arendt had diagnosed in a man who helped murder millions. The modern version is any structure that lets a person say, and genuinely feel, "I do not set the policy, I just carry it out." That category is enormous. The loan officer who forecloses without meeting the family, the content moderator, the drone operator, the bureaucrat, the mid-level employee executing a decision made 3 floors up. It is not that these people are evil. It is that a chain of command is, among other things, a machine for producing the agentic state, for making sure that at no single point along the chain does one person experience themselves as the author of the outcome. Everyone is following. No one is deciding. The result happens anyway. So the responsibility gets handed up the chain to the authority. That is the agentic state. But there is a companion mechanism that works the opposite way. It does not hand responsibility up. It spreads it sideways, thins it out, until there is not enough of it in any one place to stop anyone. And it is the reason that adding more people to a harmful situation, against all intuition, makes the harm more likely, not less. And we know it is the situation and not the person, because Milgram proved it. Not with one experiment, but with more than 20. This is the part of his work that almost never gets told, and it is the part that turns a disturbing demonstration into actual science. He took the same machine, the same script, the same kind of ordinary subjects, and changed one thing at a time, and obedience moved like a dial. In the baseline, where the learner was in another room and could only be heard, 65% went to the maximum. Put the learner in the same room, visible, a few feet away, and it dropped to 40%. Require the teacher to physically press the learner's hand down onto a shock plate, direct contact with the harm, and it fell to 30%. Distance, it turned out, had been doing quiet, moral work the whole time. The further away the consequence, the easier the switch. Then he moved the authority instead of the victim. When the experimenter gave his orders and then left the room, phoning the prods in from elsewhere, obedience collapsed to around 20%. And some subjects, now unwatched, quietly cheated, pretending to raise the voltage while secretly pressing the lowest switches. The authority had to be present to work. Move the whole thing off the Yale campus, into a rundown office building in downtown Bridgeport with no university name on the door, and obedience dropped again. The institution, not just the man, had been part of the pressure, and the single most powerful change of all. When 2 other teachers, both actors, refused and walked out, leaving the real subject to continue alone, obedience fell to 10%. The presence of even one person who says no is the strongest antidote we have ever measured. Rebellion, like obedience, is contagious. One variation returned 0. When 2 authorities gave contradictory orders, one saying continue, the other saying stop, not a single subject pushed through the conflict. An authority that is not unanimous is not an authority at all. The mechanism needs a clear, single voice from above. Give it 2, and it dissolves. Read those numbers as a set, and the conclusion is hard to avoid. The same human being will go to 450 volts or refuse at 15, depending almost entirely on how the room is arranged. Not their character, the room. Before we get to the sideways mechanism, one honest admission about this whole subject. It would be comforting if I could tell you that the people who obeyed were different from you in some detectable way. Less educated, more authoritarian, colder. Milgram looked. Others have looked for 60 years. The obedient and the defiant do not sort cleanly by personality, by intelligence, by gender, by class. The best predictor of whether a person went to 450 volts was never something about the person. It was something about the situation they were placed in. Change the room, and the same person behaves differently, which means the uncomfortable inverse is also true. Keep the room the same, and you would probably behave like most people in it. Not because you are weak, because you are human, and the mechanisms are aimed at the human, not at the weak. Now the sideways one. Mechanism 4. Diffusion of responsibility. The definition. When responsibility for an outcome is shared among several people, each individual feels only a fraction of it, and that fraction is often too small to move anyone to act. Responsibility does not add up across a group. It divides. 10 people who each feel 1/10 responsible do not produce the force of one person who feels fully responsible. They produce something closer to paralysis. Milgram tested this directly, and the numbers are stark. He ran a version where the subject did not press the switch themselves. They only did a smaller task, like reading the word pairs, while another teacher, an actor, actually delivered the shocks. Removed from the final act, freed from being the hand on the lever, obedience climbed. More than 90% went to the end. When you are one link in a chain and not the last link, the harm feels like it is happening somewhere further down the line, in someone else's hands. The mechanism does not require you to believe you are innocent. It only requires you to believe you are not the guilty one. The case that made this mechanism famous came from outside Milgram's lab, from research provoked by a real event, the 1964 death of a woman named Kitty Genovese in New York. It was reported at the time, wrongly in many of its details, as a murder witnessed by dozens who did nothing. 2 psychologists, John Darley and Bib Latane, took the disturbing premise into the laboratory. They staged emergencies, smoke seeping under a door, a person apparently collapsing. And they varied one thing: how many other people the subject believed were present. The result was consistent and counterintuitive. The more witnesses a person thought were present, the less likely any one of them was to act. Alone, people helped quickly and often. In a group, each person waited, glanced at the others, and assumed that someone else would take responsibility, or already had. They called it the bystander effect. It is diffusion of responsibility with the switch of doing nothing instead of the switch of doing harm. Put the two together, the agentic state pushing responsibility up and diffusion spreading it sideways, and you get something important. Modern institutions are, whether by design or by accident, very good at making sure that responsibility for any given outcome is both delegated upward and divided across many hands at the same time. The decision came from above you. The execution was shared beside you. And so when something terrible is produced by the system, you can search the entire organization and find no one, not one person, who experiences themselves as having done it. Everyone was a fraction. Everyone was following. The atrocity has no author. That is not a failure of the system. For a system that needs terrible things done by decent people, it is the system working perfectly. The modern version is the committee, the corporation, the bureaucracy, any structure where a harmful decision is made collectively and carried out in pieces. It was a team decision. It went through the proper channels. I just handled my part. Each of those is diffusion of responsibility said out loud. Each of them is true. And each of them is how a group of people, none of whom would individually do the thing, reliably does the thing. Which brings us to the last mechanism, and to the hardest question of all. The 4 we have named so far explain how a person keeps going. They do not yet explain how a person lives with it afterward. How the mind, having done the thing, protects itself from the knowledge of having done it. For that, we have to look at the moment the machine breaks a person, and at what grows back in the crack. There is one number in this whole study that matters more than 450. It is 150. 150 volts is the 10th switch. It is the moment the man in the next room stops merely grunting and, for the first time, uses words. He shouts that he wants out, that his heart is bothering him, that he refuses to go on. It is the first clear, verbal, human demand to stop. The first point at which continuing means overriding not a sound, but a person's plainly stated will. When researchers went back through Milgram's data decades later, one of them, the psychologist Dominic Packer, found something that reorganizes the whole picture. Almost everyone who quit at or near 150 volts. The subjects who were going to defy the experimenter did it there, at the first clear protest in words, and the subjects who pressed through 150, who resolved that first moment of crisis by continuing, overwhelmingly went all the way to the end. Past 150, defiance almost disappeared. Think about what that means. The whole thing turns on a single hinge. It is not a long, escalating struggle where the person fights the experimenter switch by switch and slowly loses. It is one real decision, made once. At the first moment, the harm becomes undeniable. And whichever way that one decision goes, the rest tends to follow on its own. Cross the hinge, and the remaining 20 switches are not 20 more decisions. They are momentum. The person has already answered the only question that was ever really being asked, which raises the deepest question in the study. How does a person cross that hinge, hear a man scream that his heart is failing, and keep pressing without breaking apart? What does the mind do to survive its own actions in real time? Mechanism 5. Moral disengagement. The definition comes from the psychologist Albert Bandura, who spent decades mapping it. It is the set of mental moves by which people selectively switch off their own moral standards so they can do something those standards forbid without the usual cost of guilt. The critical word is selectively. These people are not without morals. Their conscience is fully intact. It works perfectly on Monday, at home, with their children. Moral disengagement is not the absence of a conscience. It is the temporary, targeted, situation-specific disabling of one. And the mind has a whole toolkit for it. Bandura eventually cataloged the full toolkit. 8 distinct moves the mind uses to keep its standards switched off in one specific area while they run normally everywhere else. Moral justification, which reframes the act as serving a higher purpose. Euphemistic labeling, which changes the words. Advantageous comparison, which measures the act against something worse. Displacement of responsibility onto the authority. Diffusion of responsibility across the group. Distorting or ignoring the consequences by simply not looking. Dehumanizing the victim and blaming them. Read that list slowly, because you are not reading a description of monsters. You are reading a description of how ordinary, moral people manage to do things their own conscience forbids. And every one of those 8 was audible, in plain language, in the room at Yale. Listen to what obedient subjects actually said about the man they believed they were electrocuting. When Milgram interviewed them afterward, some of them, reaching for anything that would make it bearable, said versions of this. He was stupid. He was stubborn. He volunteered, didn't he? He should have tried harder to remember the words. He brought it on himself. Sit with how strange that is. The victim was innocent. He was strapped to a chair, in pain, begging, and a trembling, decent person, in order to keep doing what they were doing, quietly rebuilt him in their own mind into someone who partly deserved it. Not because they were cruel, because the alternative was to accept that they were harming an innocent man for no reason, and that thought could not sit in the same head as the act. So the mind resolved the contradiction the only way it could without stopping the hand. It revised the victim, and this is not confined to a laboratory with a fake machine. In 1966, a psychiatrist named Charles Hoffling ran a quiet study inside a real hospital. A stranger phoned the ward, identified himself as a doctor, and told the nurse on duty to give a patient 20 milligrams of a drug called Astraten. Everything about the order was wrong. The dose was double the maximum printed on the box. The drug was not on the approved list, and hospital policy forbade taking medication orders over the phone from an unverified voice. Every nurse, asked in advance, said she would refuse. When it actually happened, 21 of the 22 nurses began to comply, walking toward the patient with the overdose in hand, before the study stepped in and stopped them. No gray coat, no Yale, just a voice on a telephone claiming to be an authority, and a lifetime of training that said, "You do what the doctor says." The mechanism does not need the laboratory. The laboratory was only ever a mirror. This is the mechanism that closes the loop and makes the whole thing self-sustaining. The first 4 mechanisms get the switch pressed. Moral disengagement is what grows back over the wound afterward, so the person can press it again. And it runs on a deeper engine that Leon Festinger had named a few years earlier, cognitive dissonance. The unbearable friction of holding 2 truths that cannot both be true. I am a good person, and I am hurting an innocent man, has to resolve somehow. And it is far easier to bend your perception of the victim, or of who is responsible, than to stop in the middle of the act and accept that the good person belief was false. The mind almost always protects the self-image and sacrifices the accuracy of everything else. It will rewrite the world before it will rewrite you. The modern version is the language. Listen for it, because moral disengagement always leaves fingerprints in the vocabulary. It lives in every soft phrase that lets a harmful act be done at a comfortable distance from its meaning. Collateral damage, letting people go, enhanced this, streamlining that, restructuring, processing. Every field that does difficult things to human beings grows a private dialect that drains those things of their weight. That dialect is not laziness, and it is not politeness. It is moral disengagement, installed at the level of the words, so that the agentic state has something soft to speak in. When you hear a system describe harm in language that could not possibly make anyone flinch, you are not hearing dishonesty. You are hearing a conscience being managed. So now you have the whole machine. Not a machine of wires and switches. That one was a prop. The real machine has 5 moving parts. Legitimate authority gets the person into the chair. Incremental commitment dissolves the line they would have refused at. The agentic state moves the ownership of the act somewhere else. Diffusion of responsibility thins that ownership until no one holds enough of it to stop. And moral disengagement heals the wound after each pass, so the person can keep going and later live with it. 5 mechanisms, each one documented, each one on its own almost reasonable. Put together, a device for getting decent people to do terrible things and feel, at the time, that they had no real choice. And here is why we have spent 50 minutes on how it is built instead of on the horror of it. The horror tells you to look away. The way it is built tells you where to look. In 2009, a psychologist named Jerry Berger did something Milgram's experiment had been considered too dangerous to allow for decades. At Santa Clara University, under modern safeguards, he ran a careful, partial version. He stopped at that critical 150-volt hinge, screened the subjects, and halted the moment anyone crossed it. Half a century had passed. The culture had changed completely. People were supposedly more skeptical of authority, more individualist, more aware. Many of them had heard of Milgram himself. The obedience rates were essentially unchanged. That is the finding that should stay with you, longer than any number about the original study. Not that people obeyed in 1961, a different, more deferential time, easy to hold at arm's length, but that people obey now. That the mechanisms did not belong to that era, that campus, that gray coat. They belong to the way the human mind is built, which has not been updated, and to the way we keep building situations, which reproduce the laboratory without anyone meaning to. and it does not change much across borders either. When the psychologist Thomas Blass gathered the replications that had been run in other countries and other decades under different flags, with different assumptions about deference and freedom, he found something that should unsettle anyone who wants to believe obedience is a national trait. The rates were broadly similar everywhere. There was no meaningful relationship between when a study was run and how much people obeyed. Whatever this is, it did not belong to 1960s America. It travels. It is not a feature of a culture. It is a feature of the species. It is worth being honest about the debate too, because credibility is the only thing worth having here. Milgram's work has been challenged. The historian Gina Perry, going back into his archive, documented that the experiment was messier than the clean 65% suggests, that Milgram ran many variations, that some subjects suspected the shocks were not real, that the famous number came from one specific condition. These are real criticisms, and they matter. But notice what 60 years of scrutiny has not overturned: the core result. Vary the conditions, replicate it across countries and decades, tighten every control, and ordinary people still, in large numbers, follow a legitimate authority into harming a stranger. The number moves. The mechanism does not. So go back now to the certainty you were holding at the start, the quiet conviction that you would have been the 35%, the one who stood up. You might have been. Some did. The defiant were real, and understanding what let them refuse is a subject in itself. They tended to be the ones who, at that 150 hinge, took responsibility back onto themselves instead of accepting the experimenter's offer to carry it, who answered the question, "Who is responsible?" with "I am," and could not get comfortable again. That one reversal, refusing to enter the agentic state, protected people better than any personality trait. The ones who stopped tended to do a few specific things, and they are worth naming because they are the closest thing this study offers to a defense. They kept the victim real to themselves instead of abstract. They kept picturing the man, not the procedure. They named the harm plainly instead of accepting the soft words for it. They said, "I am hurting him," not, "I am administering the stimulus." They treated the first clear protest, at 150, as a line rather than a bump in the road. And when the experimenter offered to take responsibility, they turned the offer down. They refused to let the ownership of their own hands be handed to another man in the room. Notice that none of these is a trait you are born with. Each one is an act, which means the defense against the mechanism is not being a certain kind of person. It is doing a certain kind of thing at a certain moment on purpose, because the room has not gone anywhere. We build agentic states for a living now. Every layer of an organization exists, in part, to make sure that the person who decides never meets the person who is harmed, and the person who acts never made the decision. The order arrives as a policy, a metric, a ticket in a queue, a line in a spreadsheet, already stripped of the face at the other end. That is not a conspiracy. It is just what scale does, and it means the modern version of Milgram's gray coat is not a person at all. It is a process, a calm, procedural voice spread across a whole system that never stops quietly saying, "This is authorized, this is normal, this is just your part, please continue." But the certainty itself, the ease of it, the 95% who are sure, that certainty is not evidence of your character. It is the exact blind spot the mechanisms depend on. Every person in that laboratory believed, walking in, that they were the kind of person who would refuse. The belief did not protect them. In a strange way, it did the opposite. It meant they never saw the mechanisms coming because they were looking for a monster, and the mechanisms do not need one. The switch, in the end, was never on the machine. The machine was a prop. The switch is the one inside a person that turns them from author into instrument, the moment they accept someone else as responsible for what their own hands are doing. It can be flipped by a gray coat and 4 calm sentences. It can be flipped by a chain of command, a company policy, a slow slide of small permissions, a vocabulary built not to flinch. and it flips most easily in the people most certain that it never could. Legitimate authority. Incremental commitment. The agentic state. Diffusion of responsibility. Moral disengagement. 5 mechanisms named and documented at Yale more than 60 years ago. The same design is running right now in the systems you move through every day, the ones that ask you, quietly, in a calm voice, to please continue. The only real defense is to know their names. Because the one thing every one of these mechanisms needs is that you do not notice it working. Now you do.